Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 o'clock. We're going to start our webinar here in just another moment or so. We're just going to give another minute or two to have additional attendees join, and then we will get started with our Manufacturing Pulse Survey Results webinar. Okay, good afternoon again. We are going to get started with our webinar. This is Lori Harbour, President and CEO of Harbour Results. I want to welcome all of you to our 2018 Quarter 2 Tooling webinar. Just to provide clarification, we are going to go through today on this webinar the output from our Quarter 2 Pulse survey focused specifically on the tooling side of the business. We also will be having another webinar on July 25th at 9 a.m., which will focus on the production side of our data. So production being plastic molders, stampers, die casters. So we've separated them just because of the quantity of data and information. So today we'll focus on mold building and stamping dies. I want to thank all of you again for completing our survey. Many of you who are online have provided data to us consistently each quarter, so we appreciate that information. And those of you who are Harbour clients will see some of that individual output at our next meetings with you on your site. If you have not received your output from the actual survey, about 10 days ago, we sent out the full respondent output from the survey. And it was sent to each of you, your emails. It's about a 72-page or so report. So if you have not received that, please reach out to either Carol Walton or Kayla Zarowski, and we will get that sent over to you directly. There's a chance it may have gone into your spam filter, so you may want to check that as well. But you should have that on your email. So today, Kayla and I are both going to share with you different portions of today's output. We're going to talk a little bit about the current state of the industry and what we found in our recent barometer type results. We did some very special benchmarking in this last quarter where we focused on machine and software investment as well as some of the labor side of the business, apprenticeships and retention. So Kayla will go through those sections. I'll come back and talk a little bit about our top performers and what characteristics they hold for being in the upper echelon of performance. And then we will talk about a few external factors. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the economy and with particularly the tariffs, and we want to talk about how that impacts the tooling industry specifically, and then we'll summarize that. So we have a lot to share, so I'm going to jump in and get started. This information, as you know, our methodology is that we're gathering data from companies each quarter. We had this past quarter about just over 70 tool suppliers and that provided data to us, as well as automation suppliers. And then we had about 70 production companies, mostly injection mold and stamping facilities. We, of course, reach out to each of the companies and do validation with them and ensure that their data is accurate and do a whole host of analysis here prior to those calls to make sure that we're comparing and validating all the information. So we feel very strongly that this data has been vetted and has some very interesting things to share with you today. One reminder, we're going to show you a series of charts that look like this, where we show you an average in the gray bar of performance. So in this case, this is capacity. The average is what you see in the gray, and then we have a quartile chart. Rather than this just being a high and a low chart, what this tells you is that 50% of the data points are between the top and the low quartile points, and then the remaining are split below, above and below. So 25% of the population is in that top quartile and 25% in the bottom quartile. So I'd just like to remind you of that because our charts are slightly different than others you may see, and I want to make sure that that's clear as you look through. So here's the respondent outputs, again, for tooling specifically. You can see we had 74 shops. They ranged in size from shops that were under 5 million to several that were over 30 million in actual revenue, and then the split in between. Most of our respondents tend to be mold builders, with 2/3 of the population, or 3/4 of the population actually being on the mold builder side. And then you can see the split from a region perspective, where most of them have come from the US and from Canada. To look at some of the capacity situation, what we have seen in the first half of this year is that Q1 and Q2 were actually pretty soft, particularly for the mold industry. You can see in the orange line, this is the mold builders. The blue is the die builders. Die builders dipped a little bit to 88% utilization, where mold builders dropped down to 77%. And again, this is an average, so some shops were well below that and some were well above that. As you look to the forecast, many of the shops are very bullish about the back half of the year. Particularly, we're hearing from the automotive industry that some programs were slow in the first half of the year and will be launching in the back half. So you can see there's a spike expected and lots of new programs coming. So still a pretty positive year. It's just that the industry will, as usual, kind of try to put 100 pounds in a 50-pound bag in the back half of the year. Some of the reasons for the slowness in the first half of the year on the automotive side were that there was 2 vehicles, the Colorado and the Canyon, that were supposed to be released for a facelift. They did not release. They've been removed from the forecast. We all know that the Ford Fusion was canceled last year, and what they did was they decided to do a minor facelift of that program this year. So they actually sourced the tools already this year to do a minor facelift. But what would have been, the complete redo of the vehicle really became just a handful of parts. They dropped the Lincoln version, and then the Dodge Journey was removed, and the Traverse and also the Chevy Blazer were delayed a little bit, and that's what caused some of the shortness in the first half of the year. There's lots of new activity, lots of quoting, and a lot of things we're seeing in automotive that will launch in the back half of the year, however. So as a result of this slow period in the first half of the year, of course, the work on hold spiked up to 13.5%. Pretty evenly between mold and die shops, but it obviously increased because we saw some things that were released but delayed until September or October, and that meant people had the purchase orders and the commitment for work but were not able to start things. We fully expect that to come down in the third quarter as we begin to already start talking to shops now, and we're seeing a lot of programs getting released and new quote activity for the back half of the year. So one of the other things we look at is sentiment and how positive are people about the industry. As you can imagine, whenever we ask people how positive they are about the industry, if things are slow, then this metric tends to go in the wrong direction. So comparing both the second quarter of 2017 to the second quarter of 2018, we saw a pretty decent drop in sentiment from the companies out there today. The other thing that many people wrote in and told us is that they're worried about announcements on tariffs in Canada and Mexico and China and throughout. So those we're starting to see some signs of concern, although still, very positive about the industry overall in general for at least the foreseeable future. We look at company's backlog. So this is a aggregated score looking at both mold builders compared to die builders. What we do is we ask people what their backlog is, and then we convert it to months of backlog. You can see the metric there. The positive sign here is that die builders' backlog is growing, and as you know, die builders tend to have a lead time of about 5 to 6 months earlier than mold builders. So although the mold builder backlog dropped, we anticipate the back half. This is another sign for us that the back half is going to be strong because die builders will be producing those parts, and we'll see more release of mold during this time frame as well. We wanted to look at progressive or payment terms as we do each quarter as well. We had a very interesting spike in progressive payment terms in the in the second quarter. And Kayla and the team spent a lot of time analyzing and looking at every company that responded to this and the spike that occurred. And there's a couple key things that are driving this. There was a number of shops that landed non-automotive work that all came with progressive payment terms. And so when we called these companies to talk to them about it, they cited that this was part of a change in their mix, change in customer, and that drove those terms. There was also several new large domestic automotive OEM packages that were sourced with progressive terms. So the Ford F-150, several GM programs like the Traverse and the Blazer that all had progressive terms to them. And so that drove some of it based on those who responded. And then we just have a very consistent population. We looked quarter to quarter, and there's a very consistent population of people that have very high progressive terms as part of their mix. The accounts receivable paid on time continues to be sort of in a downward trend, and this is somewhat disturbing to us that we're seeing, people getting commitment to progressive terms, but they're not collecting. And so it's a continual issue in the industry, and we've been asking lots of questions about it and are just hearing, things such as we've launched a lot of tools, and so we need to catch up in cash flow in order to pay. So I don't know how true that is, but you can see on a by size basis the breakdown of this for progressive and accounts receivable. So again, every size category is seeing more progressive terms, but when you look quarter to quarter at AR paid on time, it's not going in the right direction. So we're hearing it in the plants that this continues to be a challenge. So that's sort of the basic core data we collect every quarter. Now we want to turn it over to Kayla and let her talk a little bit about the two special categories we looked at this past quarter.
Thank you, Lori. So as Lori mentioned, for quarter two, we looked at a couple of special categories we wanted to see based off of some things we've heard going on in the industry. So in Q1 of 2018, Harbour polled shops and wanted to understand what investment occurred in 2017 and what investment was planned for 2018 by shops. And we can see 2017 was a very aggressive year. It was a strong year for investments for both mold and die shops at almost 6% for die and over 7.5% for mold. Now, though 2018 is seeing a decrease from those 2017 levels, we're still at really strong investment levels at over 4.5% up to the 5% range for shops. When we look at that by revenue range, we see, again, strong investment levels were in 2017. We had shops that were less than $5 million investing almost 10.5% of their sales into their business. And they're still predicting strong 2018s with shops ranging from 4.5% up to 5.5% still. So strong, stable investment planned as we go into 2018. But where is that investment going? As I said, Harbour pulled that information in the first quarter, and we wanted to build upon that. So in quarter two, we went to seek and understand where is this investment going? What's driving these machine purchases? So for the business drivers, we can see an overwhelming amount of mold builders really cited replacements or upgrading their machines as one of their top drivers. But what's interesting to note is that die builders and mold as well, but die in particular listed capability and capacity as their top two with their drivers. So some interesting things there between the shops, maybe some strategic differences, age of equipment, things like that. But overall, in the next 24 months, tool builders as a whole are anticipating to invest in new machines at about 80% of shops right now. How does that business driver vary by region. When we looked at that information on the surface, you could see they look very similar when you're looking at them. They're all kind of picking one of these 4 categories. They're in the same order for tool shops as we anticipated. But what is really interesting to note when you dig in a little deeper is that when you look at capability and capacity, there's over a 10-point difference between Canada and US. So again, coming down to some of that strategic views that they're having. Perhaps they're looking to bring some capability in-house that they want to do. Perhaps they need to grow capacity. 2017 was an extremely busy year, so maybe some of that was driving their goal in investing in this new machinery. Part of the machine story is, what is your criteria when you're looking at machines? So when you're going to make a machine purchase, what are you deeming as your top 3 criteria that you need out of your machine or your goal is? For tooling as a whole, we see service, maintenance, and price. However, when you break it down a little further into mold versus die, you see some interesting nuances. For example, the number 1 concern for die builders was price, whereas that's 4th for mold builders. And then we see automation there is number 3 for mold builders as their top criteria, where it didn't even make it as a top 3 criteria for these die builders. So definitely an interesting dynamic there. Again, probably down to some of the strategic decisions being made when machines are being purchased. Back in 2015, Harbour polled shops to understand what machine brands they had in their facilities, what machine brands you're looking at. And again, we wanted to revisit that because this is another critical component when you're considering a new machine to bring into your facility. Overall, the machines within the top brands are very much shifted a little bit, but nothing too drastic, except for a couple that are worth noting. DMG Mori, for example. They jumped 10 spots. In 2015, they were at 12th, and in 2018, we now see them in 2nd. So they've really gained ground in those 3 years. And it's also worth noting that Makino, while still one of the top brands considered by shops, has lost some of their penetration, dropping over 20 points. And I'd like to note with that, it's not just mold and die. We're seeing that across the board. Die builders are putting Makino and DMG up there, and mold builders. So that jump you see in DMG is not just one particular subset of shops bringing it up. So machines are one resource within your facility that you guys are considering investing in. However, there's another big resource that helps drive your workflow, and that would be software. We wanted to understand what shops were looking to invest in the next 24 months when it comes to software. Overwhelmingly, the response was machine monitoring softwares. But we also can't discredit some of the replacements that folks are looking at with CAD and CAM. I mean, over a quarter of shops, no matter the type, are looking to upgrade or replace their CAD software in the next 24 months. And for mold builders, over a quarter of shops are looking into CAM software. So a lot of shifting occurring there within the facility. As I mentioned, machine monitoring was really the top software highlighted as the software folks wanted to invest in the next 24 months. So we did a deeper dive on that. We can see some interesting things here when we look at it by mold and die. Over 80% of the shops, from a mold perspective, implemented or are considering machine monitoring, whereas the reverse is actually true. 80% of shops in the die space are considering or at a no phase for machine monitoring. So again, some different nuances there on the percentage breakdown where shops are considering software. Could come down to some strategic decisions or the types of machines within the facilities themselves. We also looked at this by revenue range to see if there was an understanding of different shop sizes in looking at software in a certain way. And we saw overwhelmingly that all of the shops that were greater than 30 million have either implemented or are considering machine monitoring. They are not at a no phase for implementing this software within their facility. Again, we talked about criteria with machines, so it only makes sense we're going to have criteria that we want to achieve when we're investing in software within the facility. So we looked at this by by a United States and Canadian breakdown to see, is there a difference amongst the regions? The top 6 highlighted are very similar. 5 are identical across the top 6 between the two regions. However, there is one on each side that's interesting to note. On the US side, we see price as a top concern that was called out, number 2, while on the Canadian side, price didn't appear at all. And then for Canadian shops that responded for machine monitoring, they cited their number one criteria when considering the software is being able to measure efficiency. And that, again, was nowhere in the top 6 for the U.S. shops that responded. So some interesting dynamics there. Again, probably some things with strategy within the companies, possibly some social implications there around what's being offered to them grant-wise and whatnot. So we've talked about the resources within your facility related to machines and software, but we also wanted to explore the additional resources of employees. They're what drives those machines and the software within your facility. Specifically, we wanted to look at attracting, retaining talent, as well as what's going on with apprentices. So the average age in the industry is shifting. 3 years ago, in 2015, the average age in the tool and die industry was 55 years. Now we see that the average age in the industry is 50.2. So we've seen about a 5-year decrease in that age. So it's slowly coming down. What Harbour did is we asked shops about their average age in their overall facility and then 3 major departments. We wanted to understand that. Then we did an analysis with an assumption that apprentices were about 21 years old, and when we removed them, our analysis showed a 3+ year difference, between 3 and 4 usually, depending on your department, difference in age. So we really are seeing apprentices bringing that average age down a bit. But that brings us to the challenge that all shops are seeing, that this young talent, how do you retain it? How do you attract it? How are you getting this talent in your door to gain these skills that you need? So what recruiting processes are shops trying to attract this talent? Across the board, no matter the shop type, we're seeing various methods being tried. Everything from physical, digital, partnerships with schools, whatever it might be. We're seeing a lot of shops trying various methods to get the right talent, especially at this time when we're seeing extremely low unemployment levels. We're fighting for very little talent that's actually available at this stage. Once you've found the talent, how are you keeping them? Obviously, you want to find the right people. You get them into your facility. That's excellent. But how are you keeping them engaged? How are you keeping them within your facility and interested? So we looked at this by U.S. and Canada. From a bonus perspective, shops are very similar across the board. Over 3/4 of the shops are considering or offering bonus programs already. But what is extremely interesting is around some of the incentives and benefits. Overall, when you look at U.S. and Canada, very similar rankings for these benefits, and the difference in percentages can really be accounted to some of the differences in the social and economic breakdown in the country. So how, for example, Canada offers different retirement benefits from the U.S., those things will vary. So the difference in percentages is very much expected. But what is most interesting is some of the lack of difference here, the lack of creativity in these benefits. These are some things that many shops, not even just in this industry, but many organizations are offering their employees now. So there's nothing here that necessarily differentiates one shop from the other. We've been doing, as you know, Harbour's been out in shops, and we've been seeing some interesting things. Lori was telling me how she visited a shop that's actually purchased a church and turned it into a dormitory. And they're trying some innovative things. They're bringing staff in from Puerto Rico to train these guys in their facility and offering them the option to live in these dorms, helping them out, get established in the community, and that's benefiting the shop. And this is, again, kind of a different way of approaching things to get the talent you need in your facility. And then apprentices. So we talked about apprentices. They're very much a part of our shops, and we can't forget them. So when we look at apprentices overall, when Harbour researched this information 3 years ago in 2015, the average was at about 11%. So we've seen an increase now 3 years later by about 1% overall to 12%. And when you look at it via mold and die, fairly similar, between 10 and 14% on average. But what's most interesting is the shift we've seen with the shops that are less than 5 million and then the shops that are greater than 30 million. We see the shops that are less than 5 million have a larger percent, even those compared to those that are between 5 and 30 million. And this is a function of they're they have limited revenue that they're working with. They need the talent. However, they're dealing with a constraint on, should I hire an apprentice who comes with a different salary versus somebody who has 30 years experience? So they're tending to hire apprentices, raise them up into their culture and their processes. Whereas the shops that are greater than 30 million are seeing an increase in apprentices related to they have large staff, and they also have a strong knowledge base in their older staff that is at the stage where they want to start thinking about retirement. So they're looking at making sure they have the right staff coming up, knowledge transfer, having that knowledge available. And then the shops between the 5 and 30 stayed fairly stable overall between the 3 years, shifting slightly, but nothing too drastic there. So some interesting things from a resource perspective we wanted to bring you for this quarter. And I'll hand it back to Lori to take you guys through the top performers.
Thank you, Kayla. So we want to just show a couple specific slides. As you know, go ahead, you can go to, you can look at how we've sort of split out what we call the top performers. As many of you know, we tend to look very closely at the metric of revenue per full-time equivalent. So what we see is that companies that are at 170,000 an employee or higher, these tend to be some of the best shops that we see. And of course, it is inextricably linked to their profitability. So what we did was we took the data from this quarter and we said, let's look at the top performers that are greater than 170 and compare them to the others that are below that mark. So some of their characteristics, of course, sentiment is really positive for both. They have a little lower average overtime. Average age is about 44. But what's very interesting is most companies have said to me in the past that, you know, these top performers tend to always be very large shops. So you can see we have 25 shops in this category, and 8 of them are actually under 10 million. So it's not a given that you have to be big to be profitable and drive throughput, but it's also not a given that if you're big that you are performing that well. We have a lot of companies that are in the lower grouping that are very large shops and are not doing nearly as well as we would have expected them. So we looked at a series of metrics for them. So the highest throughput shops are working less overtime. This is an interesting one and one that I've really been hitting on in shops that I've been attending and visiting lately, in that we tend to give people 50 to 50 hours a week of work, and then when I ask them where their capacity is, it's 60 or 65%. And so I struggle with having people working that kind of hours at that kind of cost. I realize we have to keep our employees, so we have to keep them happy and content. But those best shops are really managing this metric in a different way, and they're working to drive down overtime and manage it when appropriate. You can see the top quartiles at about 15% versus 18% in the bottom 3 quarters. The best shops also have more progressive payment terms. They're pushing back and managing how they do their payments, but they're also managing how they get paid. So they tend to have people focused on making phone calls and anticipating payments and ensuring that the cash flow is coming into the business. On this next one, we look at backlog. You can see it's not dramatically higher, but the top quarter has a little bit higher backlog in their business. But the other thing that top companies are doing right now is managing their outsourcing. Last year, many of you will remember in tooling, we were seeing 25 and 30% outsourcing because it really was our highest sourced year in history, quite frankly. Right now, outsourcing is down quite a bit, but the best companies are working to keep that as low as possible. And then work on hold is comparable. Frankly, it's probably something that's really out of your control and not much you can do about it within your business. From a capital expenditure standpoint, the top performers are really spending more. It shows you on this chart that on a percentage basis, they're spending a little less, but dollar value, they're spending much more than the others overall. And, you know, we have a very comparable list of shops here, 25 and 25 in each of these categories. So, but again, as Kayla said, investment we're seeing continue to be strong, although down a little bit, or at least forecasted to be down a little bit in 18. And frankly, I think it's because many shops put a lot of equipment in last year, and there's some slowdown of that, although we are still seeing a lot being purchased these days. So lots of activity. The top performers are investing more in recruitment. They're spending more time partnering with their schools and putting in full apprentice programs, coming up with creative ways to recruit and going to job fairs and different types of approaches to find labor. And as Kayla said earlier, I think we're starting to really see just a handful of shops be a little bit more creative about how they bring people in, what they're offering them, and how they retain them. And frankly, I think this is going to be critical going forward. Bonus programs are comparable, and we're seeing a lot more of them across shops. And of course, the bottom line is that it hits the profitability of companies. That top quarter just tends to be more profitable. On average, those 25 shops we have in this category are averaging 12% EBIT, which is earnings before interest and tax. And you can see the quartile, 25% of them are 16%. So it's a very strong performance. There's certainly some that are below that number. But 3 points of profit between 9 and 12% is a pretty significant amount of cash in a business of this type of size. So the last section we want to go through is to talk a little bit about some of the external factors that are going on in the market, and then we'll be happy to answer some questions about this because I know there's a lot of interest on this front right now. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about what's going on with the tariffs. Many of you know Kara Walton from our organization, and she's been spending pretty much day in and day out researching this topic for us and getting knowledgeable about it, and it moves every single day. So as you know, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that most of you have not read, but I want to keep in perspective. We really have two separate issues here that I want to talk about, and I've been to about 15 shops in the last couple of weeks, and I'm surprised at how much confusion there is between steel and aluminum tariffs and China tariffs. So I want to try to bring some perspective to those. So the facts about steel and aluminum are that we have this 25% tariff on imported steel. As you know, the president put this in place many, many months ago, but he put an exclusion on Canada and Mexico and the European Union. And back in the May timeframe, he lifted that exclusion, which really had to do with the fact that the NAFTA agreement started to fall apart and the negotiations fell apart. So he decided to lift it and impose those tariffs on Canada and Mexico and Europe. So this basically means any steel that's being imported from those regions will pay a 25% tax as of that May timeframe. Now, one of the things we've, of course, found out is that if that steel has been modified in any way, shape, or form, it will then have a different H code, which means it will no longer be subject to the tariff. So, for example, if a Canadian, which 80% of Canadian tool makers buy their steel from North America, or from the U.S., if they buy a block of steel from Fenkel out of the U.S. and that thing gets an eye bolt put in it, or a hole, or a surface cut, it's now considered sort of a part, and it avoids the tariff. So you've got steel mills that are looking to, start to do some of that value add to help support. And keep in mind that, as we say here in the third bullet, Canada, Mexico, and Europe impose their own retaliatory tariffs. So if a Canadian is buying a block of steel, it's going the other way, right? So the Canadian are collecting 25% for steel coming into Canada, and U.S. is collecting it for it coming in from those other countries. Of course, there's a 10% steel or a tariff on aluminum that is imported. And what's key about all of this is that, the U.S. is making about 82 million metric tons of steel, but they're importing 35 million, and they're exporting 10 million. And in fact, the U.S. exports 42% of their steel to Canada, and they're importing 17% of it from Canada. So, there's a huge impact here, particularly for the Canadian mold building industry, but several companies are buying steel from other regions as well. As you guys know, steel prices have gone up considerably, 15 to 20% anyways, even in anticipation of this. You guys are already seeing it. And most interestingly is that, the Department of Commerce is fielding applications for exclusions on this. They have something like 30,000, filings or applications on exclusion. and they have hired about 30 new people who are young and interested in a job and don't know anything about steel. And they're the ones that are reviewing this. They've had about 2 hours of training. So the concern that I have for all of you, and it does really affect many of you. I realize there's some of you who just buy steel locally and maybe it doesn't affect you today. But the great concern I have is that it's creating transactional waste in your business, because you as a business have to start tracking all of the certificate of origin of where your steel comes from and have to be able to prove that at any given point. So this steel and aluminum tariff is real and it is happening. I mean, we've been at shops that they're already started to pay it. And frankly, the customers are resisting accepting some of this additional cost, especially for those tools that were already in process. So the second point that I want to make, which is absolutely separate from steel and aluminum tariffs, is that there is a Chinese tariff in place that was instituted just a couple weeks ago and will take effect next Friday, July 6th. So the president put a 25% tariff on $50 billion of Chinese imports that's set to take place on July 6th, and we have confirmed that it absolutely includes molds and dies. And so what this means, and we have several plastics processors who are customers of ours who have tools over there who, are shipping them back after July 6th, some of them who actually got them shipped over this week or next week before the 6th. But those who are after the 6th will be paying that 25% tariff. The U.S. has said that if China retaliates, which they have not done yet, but may start as of next Friday, that the Trump administration has another $200 billion of Chinese imports that they plan to tariff. We had a meeting yesterday with the OASA Tooling Council, and we heard from Ann Wilson, who's a lobbyist in Washington, who said that, this $200 billion is real. Currently, to date, there are some very specific exclusions in this $50 million. For example, phones and computers and, things that are shoes, clothing, consumer products is not in that $50 billion. So he was very specific to make it about manufactured parts. But this $20 billion will open up for essentially everything else. So this will apply to both components and molds and dies. The tariff will be imposed, as I said, when it hits the U.S. border, and it will be the entire tool, regardless of when you started to build it or shipped it. There is also a process for exclusion as well. And there's a whole lot of activity around this concept of substantive transformation and how much there's some kind of fine print around this in terms of what you do here as a tool builder versus there. Now, I know that there's a lot of companies that have said to me, this is great, Lori. I'm glad we're tariffing China, especially those of you who are American mold builders who would love to see more business come back over here. And I'm not going to tell you that I completely disagree with that. I think there's a lot of good opportunity that can come our way here in North America. The challenge is, as you know, it's jobs to grow our business, it's capacity for tooling, and it's the fallout effect of this trade war that is going to cause much broader issues. And frankly, yesterday, the Washington lobbyist is predicting now a recession in 2019 and 2020 driven by this trade war. So just a prediction, not mine, but we'll see if that's part of what she's suggesting. Now, the third piece of this, which has not even come to fruition yet, is that around the same time frame, this end of May, Memorial Weekend time frame, the president made the decision that he also wanted to execute on Section 232 and make an investigation on imported cars and parts. So this is yet a third piece of this puzzle. And what this means is that if the Department of Commerce comes back and finds that imported cars and parts are a threat to national security, they are talking about proposing about we heard yesterday about a minimum of 20%, but maybe up to 30% tariff on cars coming into this country, as well as all parts. So the concern we have, as you can see on the left, is that the U.S. produces 11 million vehicles a year, but we sell 17 and a half. So we get parts in cars from Mexico, we get parts in cars from Canada, and we get parts in cars from Europe, and of course parts from China and other regions of the world. So the impact on the auto industry from our perspective equates to about a 15 to 25% decrease in profit per vehicle. So this is the profit that the OEMs are producing. So why does this matter to you as a tool maker or a processor? The bottom line is if the OEMs don't have the money to invest in new vehicles, they will cut programs and they will do less. And I know that this sounds very automotive because in this particular case it is, but you've all been reading the stories of Harley-Davidson and Caterpillar and John Deere and others who will move production to other countries because of some of these tariffs. And again, that will impact where molds are produced and will have an impact across the industry. Ann Wilson from Washington yesterday said there is not a doubt in her mind that this will be imposed. Everyone she's talked to on Capitol Hill who's very close to this says it will happen. And what's most interesting is that when he institutes Section 232, they're given 232 days to the Department of Commerce to come up with a report to make a recommendation. It was close to that for steel and aluminum, but she has said that this decision on car parts and cars will be made by September because he wants to make this decision in order to affect our elections for midterm in November. So we would anticipate that this is going to come through here in the next few months at the end of summer when everybody reconvenes. So, and the last piece about this is the NAFTA portion. At the end of the day, the whole steel and aluminum tariffs were lifted for Canada and Mexico because they walked from the table back in May. They walked from the table because there's an argument about the rules of origin and that the U.S. hopes to increase the rule of origin from 62.5% to 85% for NAFTA region. And they want to add this U.S. specific requirement of 50%. And then he threw in this sunset clause at the last minute. And so both the Canadians and the Mexicans walked from the table and said that they would not come back at this point. And the challenge is that the Canadians, they may come back to the table, but there's definitely a war between Trudeau and Trump. And there's a little bit of, we kind of joke in the office here, maybe pouting going on between the two of them. And the Mexicans are in election time right now. They have a major election in July, and the front-running candidate is against NAFTA. And given his goal is to bring more manufacturing to Mexico, right? So if there's more production in Mexico, tools can still come from China and just go straight to Mexico, and they'll avoid tariffs. So there's a whole lot of intertangled mess in all four of these issues: steel and aluminum tariffs, China tariffs, automotive imported cars and parts, and then this whole NAFTA thing. So our work that we're doing here is to prep for our October 25th tooling event, where we can work to provide better opportunities and ideas about what to do and how to tackle this issue. The most important thing we can tell people today is reach out to us. We have a lot more information. Reach out to local people within your experts and your people you rely on. Ann Wilson strongly recommended next week. There are several events in every state because senators and congressmen are on vacation. Essentially, they'll be back in their hometowns doing events, and she thinks we should be there and we should tell them how we feel about these issues. So the best thing is to get educated and get knowledgeable so that we can attack this. We do have a call to action that came out of the OESA meeting yesterday. We will be meeting with Washington through MEMA and with OESA, and we're going to talk specifically about the tool industry and talk with the board of governors from the OESA Tooling Council and MEMA to talk about what does this mean for tooling. And she's going to carry our message forward to lobbyists and to people within Capitol Hill about tooling. So just another voice for us to continue to push this forward. The last two things I want to share with you are focused on sort of the forecast for the future. Again, we'll be looking at a lot more of this in the fall and October, but what is important that I wanted to point out is that I mentioned there was a soft first half of the year. This data is the latest data from LMC, and last year, as you all know, was a big year. We did launch over 60 vehicles. This year was planned to be just as large. However, many of those launches have already shifted from the first half of the year. So we anticipate some reduction of the 63 in addition into next year of some launches. But what's most important to point out that I know many of you know, I've mentioned I have some concern of some softening in the industry. In 2019, in the automotive industry, we have 51 launches planned. And when you look at that, the majority of those launches are Asian companies, Honda, Nissan, Toyota, and Hyundai. And the reason this is important is because in 2018, the number of launches for GM, Ford, and Chrysler was 33, or is planned to be 33. In 2019, it's only 14. And that's a drop of about $4 billion in spend or demand for tooling. So my concern is most tool makers in the automotive industry do not support the Asian companies, and they certainly don't support Hyundai because Hyundai makes all their tools in Korea. So those of you in the automotive industry, which I know not everyone on the phone is in auto, but those of you in the industry will see some softening if you're not supporting Asian companies. And what that means to those of you who are tool makers not in the automotive industry is that automotive tool makers are going to be looking for other work in other industries with other companies. So this is our future forecast as we've shown it. And in the past couple of years, we've shown this swing analysis. So using our LMC data, we adjust it 2 months up or 2 months down. So you can see the forecast in the orange bar is really the LMC forecast. And then we've frankly put together what we believe to be our estimate. And last year, we actually did do $10.3 billion in tooling in the automotive industry. And that was the highest ever. And it was a very painful year. There were several tool suppliers not in auto who took on auto work to help out with outsourcing. And it gave work to the whole of the tool industry. 2018 was predicted to be $12 billion. And still, frankly, the LMC data shows $12 billion based on the vehicles launched. But we know the first half of the year has already stripped away a few billion of that. And we think that our forecast is going to be much closer to about $9.5 billion, considering where quoting and the capacity has been and what we're seeing and talking to people in the industry. Next year, about $8 billion, but again, a lot of that's Asian tooling. And then you can see the balance of 2020 and 21. We do think that we're going to see some spillover into a couple of these years. And what this data really has shown me is what we said last fall, that we really think there's a threshold of about $8.5 to $9.5 billion a year. Last year was painful. I don't think anybody wants to go through it, even though we were busy. Companies lost profit because they had to outsource and made mistakes and many things that occurred. So I think we're going to start to see this level off a little bit around our threshold. So that's just kind of a glimpse of our forecast, and we'll certainly shed more light on that as we move into the third quarter. So just in summary with what we shared to you today, we really do see, we saw a slowdown, but we are really bullish about the back half of the year. We think both in automotive and non-automotive, we've talked to some non-automotive big OEMs as well, and there's a lot of programs coming in many different industries, several medical customers we have that have a lot of activity. So we expect the back half of the year to be strong. There is great variation that we're seeing in the purchasing of equipment and in software. I think the point that Kayla made about the movement that DMG and Makino have seen is significant. There's a lot that speaks to automation that companies are looking to implement. And I know several people would tell me that DMG is just dropping their price to gain market share, but we're absolutely seeing technology advancements from their equipment and in the shops that they're in. And Makino is certainly doing their part to also come back with new technology and automation and equipment as well. Lots of machine monitoring software. This, to me, screams volumes about trying to get our equipment running at full capacity. We need to gain more capacity and more opportunity to bring in more work without adding new equipment or new people. So people are really looking at efficiency. Obviously, the issues around people will be with us forever, right? We have a very low unemployment rate. We are bringing more skilled, new people into the skilled trade, but not nearly as fast as we would like to. and shops have to be creative. This is going to be more difficult than ever to attract talent and retain talent. So great variation in performance still exists, but we are really very strong about seeing, what we're seeing in the industry right now. There are some companies that are struggling, but we're seeing some really good performance of shops and lots of new innovative technology and improvement, even within just process improvement. So we feel really good about the industry, and we're doing a lot to kind of figure out what the next step is into 2019 as we prepare for our fall event. So that's all we have for you today. We obviously, go back one second. We want to just thank our partners as always. We do a lot of work with companies that many of you know here, and we couldn't do what we do without them, so we want to make sure we give credit to them. We want to open it up for any questions that you may have within the webinar. So if there's things that we can address, we will absolutely do that now. And if there's things we run out of time for, we will contact you specifically. But we do have a few questions here. So the first one, we had a question about a trend chart not equaling 100%. I'm not sure I know which chart we're talking about.
There's actually multiple. So the trend doesn't equal 100% on some of the charts across the categories because the percent isn't this percent of 100 pie. It's a percent of the shops. So if there's 87 and 100 shops had responded, 87 shops cited, say, that as a top concern or their top reasoning. So some of them that don't add up to 100 is a function of the fact that you're not doing it out of 100%, only picking one. They could pick top 3. So I understand where you're coming from with that. If it's unclear, if you're looking through the deck and there's some questions on specific charts, please don't hesitate to send me a note. Again, Kayla Zarowski, my email is in both the respondent output and this webinar deck, which we will be getting out to folks as well. So, which I think also answers a question about getting the slides.
Yep.
We've recorded the webinar today, and we're planning to get that out to you guys. And I know we're going to be getting the
slide deck,
out to you guys as well. So you will be getting this information.
So you'll be getting that, Steve, sent to you probably within the next 24 hours, I'm guessing. The other question we have is value added per FTE a better measure than sales revenue per FTE for a manufacturer? So the difference for us is that when we look at value add, what we are doing is we have to adjust, especially in the tool industry, we have to adjust for the outsourcing and for the overtime. So our measurement is total revenue less outsourcing, and then divided by the full-time equivalent. So we ask you how much overtime you run, and then we take your employment and create an FTE. The reason that's critical is because, as you know, in the tool industry, most people are running at something like 20% overtime, sometimes 30% overtime. So we need to factor in the additional labor associated with it. But also companies are outsourcing like never before. So we need to get to a value that's done in the plant itself. Otherwise, our data wouldn't be comparable. There's another step that we actually need to take, and we will be taking next year, which is going to full value add, which would be also subtracting material, because people's material content varies. So if someone's making a bumper fascia and that's 40% of their material content versus someone making a 300-ton mold for, a 4-cavity tool, that might only be 20% material content. So our next level of advancement is going to be to look at taking out the material cost. We have a lot of it for people today, but not everyone, and that's a change we need to make. So we really believe that it is better than direct sales revenue per FTE because of it. It really gets you to an apples-to-apples comparison. Those are the questions we have. Does anybody have any others they would like to add or things that we can address today on our webinar? Okay. If no other questions, we will wrap up today's webinar. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this. We are working to try to do more of these webinars because we know it's difficult for people to come out to events, and we'd like to be able to provide ability to explain some of the data that we have. So we greatly appreciate you all participating. We will send out the output to you. A reminder, our production webinar will be July 25th, where we will talk about plastics processors and stampers and show similar data on performance in terms of profit and throughput and other aspects. And Kayla has on the screen today, right now, our emails and contact information. If there's other things you want to ask us about, feel free to contact us, and we will be happy to get you the answers to those questions. So thank you all again for participating, and we look forward to having you on future webinars. Have a good day.